I am so honored to be here today with Dr. John Vervaeke and Dr. Michael Levin. Both of these gentlemen have so enriched my lives with their work and their generosity to share all of their knowledge with us. So those of us in this little corner will know of both of them. And so I'm going to put in my show notes some videos that link up to their work so that those of you who aren't familiar with them will understand why I'm having the two of them talk together. So Dr. John Vervaeke received his bachelor's from McMaster's in philosophy and a bachelor's in science from the University of Toronto with a specialty in cognitive science and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Toronto. And he now teaches there in the areas of perception, cognition, and cognitive neuroscience. And our little corner has profited from learning from John about the 4 E's of cognition and the 4 P's of knowing, and also from his 50-episode series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And I hope that we get to explore meaning today. And Dr. Michael Levin received his bachelor's in computer science and also in biology from Tufts University, and a PhD in genetics from Harvard with a postdoc in cell biology. Mike is also the principal investigator at the Levin Lab. There's lots of information on the Tufts website from his lab. It's just marvelous to explore. He's a distinguished professor in the Department of Biology and director of the Allen Discovery Center at Tufts University. So John's research is in cognition at the human level, I guess I could say, and Mike's is at the cellular level. And I know both of you have an interest in how this phenomena scales at all levels. And so I think it might be a good idea to start with how each of you define some of these terms. So let's maybe start with cognition and how you differentiate that or might differentiate that from intelligence and consciousness.
I'll go first if you wish. So cognition I would take as a much broader category. Although typically when we use it in cognitive science, there's an implicit reference to human cognition. So just so there's not confusion around that. But I think the term cognition is a broader term, and it applies to anything that is doing information processing in a manner that reliably allows it to solve problems and achieve goals that are in some way relevant to it as some kind of causal whole. And I do think that what constitutes what we call intelligence is a feature that we take to be prototypically exemplified in human beings. And this is carried by the notion of general intelligence, that we are capable of solving a wide variety of problems in a wide variety of domains. And as I've argued in publication and presentation and in discussion, I think the core ability here is a feature I call relevance realization. That's the core ability behind intelligence. I would like to say that just up front, I've always been a strong advocate because of the deep influence of Evan Thompson on me on the deep continuity hypothesis. I think Mike's work is exemplary of this, and not just, I don't mean just, I'm not just categorizing it. I think it's insightful and exemplary of how this could work in powerful ways. I do think it also gives some evidence to a claim I've made a little bit more humorously, but with some seriousness in it, that I think biology is the philosophically important science right now. I think physics is philosophically overrated. There hasn't been significant theoretical advance in a long time, where in biology is generating ideas that immediately, almost immediately, percolate out into cognitive science and other areas and other domains. And so I just also wanted to compliment Mike on his work. I've read some of your papers, and I just wanted to say that we'll probably differ in detail, but I think in broad strokes, there's a lot of convergence. I am very, very grateful to Karen for introducing me to your work, because your work, and I don't mean to sound exploitative, but your work allows me to strengthen arguments I've been independently making. So I wanted to also thank you for that.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, that's very kind, and I'm also really happy to have this opportunity to talk, because I do think there are these kind of scale-free principles that apply all the way up through the levels of complexity, and I'm just delighted to be able to bounce ideas off of you that might be much more relevant to the human context than what we normally deal with. So I think that's a great opportunity we have here. So yeah, so thank you both. I guess with respect to the definitions, I agree in that I think cognition is a kind of umbrella term for lots of different capacities. Intelligence I take to be a kind of competency in navigating some particular space. That might be the old familiar three-dimensional space that we're very used to watching animals and humans navigate with various degrees of success to have their various goals met. But there are also some unconventional spaces that we study. So the space of all possible gene expressions, the space of possible physiological states, what we call morphospace, which is the space of possible anatomical configurations, for example, for your various body organs. So we study the ability of various systems, natural, artificial, and then even chimeric systems, to navigate these spaces in interesting ways. So some of them are very sort of modest capacity. So all they know how to do is go in a straight line, and if they're blocked, that's it. Others are very clever and they can find new solutions in these spaces. In fact, some are really clever and they find new spaces to explore. So intelligence for me is all about that. It's all about navigating these problem spaces in novel, with some degree of novelty. And I think, in our work, I mean, I'm very interested in frameworks for understanding these things that are not tied to specific life histories or specific compositions. So I want a way to understand cognition and intelligence that does not require that we have a brain of a familiar mammalian organization that would work with alien life. It would work with synthetic life. It would work with artificial intelligence. We should have a framework that is able to look at these things regardless of what they're made of or how they got here, meaning designed, evolved, or some combination. So I tend to stretch these concepts from cognition, like cognition, intelligence, and so on. I stretch them onto systems that maybe some people find surprising that one would use these terms, but I think we can talk about why one would do that.
So, well, I'm just going to pop in here for a second, because I was reading a paper that I think that you did together with Chris Fields. I've got the notes here, and I just have it was a paper with Chris Fields, so I'm assuming you were also on it, where you're talking about meaning, and you're focusing on 3 questions foundational to the study of meaning. And John, when I read these 3 questions, I just thought, it sounds like they're talking about relevance realization. So John, you can tell me whether I'm right or not, okay?
I thought the same thing when I read it.
So you're talking about those 3 questions. How do living systems distinguish between components of their environments, considering some to be objects worthy of attention and others to be background that is safely ignored? And how do living systems switch their attentional focus from one object to another? And how do they create and maintain memories of past events, including past perceptions? So, John, when you talked about relevance realization, you said you held that at the human level. But I think that Mike and Chris are talking about this scale-free idea when they're talking about it. So what would you do with that, John?
Well, I would add one more thing. I think there's a question of how the memory is accessed and coordinated is also a significant problem. Memory is not just sort of a lookup table. So I would add that in. I guess for me, I've already sort of indicated that I'm not opposed to extending the ideas of relevance realization outside of human cognition. I agree with Mike about the very real possibility of the multiple realizability of cognition and intelligence, that we don't have to have a particular substrate. I have another assumption, but I don't think Mike violates it, that relevance realization depends on being implemented by an autopoietic system, because I think only self-making systems properly can have needs. And without needs, it does not make sense to talk about relevance or importance or any of the synonyms. So I would add that in as well. But as far as I can tell, Mike is already in agreement with that in powerful ways. The issue I get, I don't know if there's an issue of disagreement here, because I'm facing what you might call, I think that the mechanisms, the trade-off processes by which relevance realization occurs, and I've been arguing this since 2012, are so similar, perhaps isomorphic, to how the evolution of species occurs, the selection and variation processes, replication, a feedback cycle, etc. And in fact, that for me has been a basis of a claim for that some of our knowing isn't done through representation, but by actually instantiating the very principles within our cognition that are extant and powerful in reality. So I'm already deeply committed to that. I suppose it may therefore be, and Mike, you can correct me on this, but I suppose it may be a difference of degree rather than kind. I'm interested in the kind of relevance realization that we're finding difficult to give to artificial intelligence, the kind of relevance realization that makes for, as I said, a problem solver that can solve a wide variety of problems in a wide variety of domains in a way that is somehow integrated and unified. It's not chaotic or random. So I suppose what that means for me, and I'm also interested, what that means for me is I'm interested in that level of relevance realization that overlaps with that domain general capacity for cognition, and as I've elsewhere argued, plausibly the central function of consciousness. And I know that Mike is much more careful around attributions of consciousness, at least in the papers I've read. So I don't know if that answers your question, but in one sense, I'm already committed because to the idea that there is a structural isomorphism between the trade-off mechanisms, what I call the virtual engine that's operative within intelligence and what's operative within evolution. They're both dynamic systems with virtual engines of selection and variation generation that shape an ongoing feedback cycle. I think that's what dynamical systems theory is largely all about. So again, I'm already committed to that. I think it's the foundation for like the idea of participatory knowing. I even, in conversation with Jonathan Pajot, have considered the idea that there might be something fundamental to ontology in terms of why selection and variation keeps showing up at all of these levels by which sense is being made. Why is that the case in this scaled invariant manner, unless it's not pointing to something important about the ontology that we find ourselves in? So that's my somewhat tangled, but attempt to be precise in an answer.
Yeah. Wow. I resonate with a lot of these points. I mean, the fundamental place that I'm coming from is when I first, as a child, was made aware of the fact that we all develop by this embryonic development process from an oocyte. I mean, this basically turned everything for me sort of upside down for the rest of my life, because it's very clear right here. Every day you have this incredible journey from something you might call just physics, and I hate that term, but people use it. This is just physics. So this is some sort of quiescent oocyte. It's a little bag of chemicals that really isn't doing anything. Nobody would call it, cognitive and all of that. And then very slowly but surely, it turns into something like whatever we are that will make claims about second order cognition and we are not machines and all these kinds of things. But that process is extremely slow. And there's never really some lightning bolt that suddenly sort of turns it, from just physics to now you're cognitive. It's a very slow, gradual process. And so that process seems to me to be at the core of all of the things that we're talking about, is how do we become, slowly but surely, we become minds out of some piece of physics and chemistry. And, it's sort of it's an inescapable fact. And the most amazing thing about that process is that it isn't hardwired. So there are lots, at least in most creatures, it has amazing plasticity, so that if you were to intervene along the way, it shows not only the ability to, in William James's definition of intelligence, so the same ends by different means, right? So not only does it show the ability to get to the same point despite all kinds of weird things you might do to it, but in fact, oftentimes it has these, what we might call creative solutions that are completely novel, that are never normally done in standard development or standard evolution to solve these problems. And so, with Chris Fields and in other contexts, we think of very, very hard about how does this arise? What happens at this exactly what John just said, this autopoietic appearance of the self for the first time, right? Very primitive, long before you're a human or anything like that. And I think what you've been emphasizing, which is the tracking of salience and what's actually important to you and so on, is really fundamental to driving everything else. Because just here's a very simple story one can tell. When you are a simple agent, because unlike AI, and I think you made a good point there too, unlike modern AIs, you live under a really strong resource constraint. So you don't have all the energy you need to do whatever you want. You don't have all the time to do whatever you want. You have to be efficient or you're going to be eaten. You will not survive if you don't get efficient about using your limited energy budget to sense and to act on things that have causal potency. You have to get really good at what now scientists are only recently, Eric Hole, he's a scientist in my center. He developed an amazing toolkit for really quantifying causality. It's a striking finding, because up till now that was a philosophical question, reductionism or not, is there power to these higher levels? He actually developed some math that answers the question. It's amazing. And so we are only now able to do it formally, but every creature can do that informally by recognizing that this nexus between various causes and effects, I'm going to coarse grain that, and I'm going to call that my arm, or I'm going to call it a cat, or whatever I'm going to call it. I'm now tracking that, and I'm spending all kinds of energy tracking it and trying to manipulate it. And then this here is a wall, and I'm going to spend almost no energy talking to this, because that gets me nowhere. And so the ability to do this kind of causal partitioning of your environment into things that make a difference, things that are really going to pay off when you spend your limited energy budget to track them and to communicate with them and to try to force them to do various things and so on. So I think right after that, once you get good at that, the next thing you might do is you might turn that same lens onto yourself. And you might realize that, hey, wait a minute, I'm a great causal agent, and you might establish some boundaries where your own model of yourself and where you end and where the outside world begins. That's not obvious at all in biology, where that every cell is some other cell's external environment in your body, right? So the question is, well, how do the different organs sort of make that? And we can talk about how embryos arise in a blastoderm and all that, but that process of recognizing yourself as a causal agent is really important piece of autopoietic self-building. And I can easily imagine that later on that can translate into things like once you start to tell stories about other things being causal agents and yourself being a causal agent, not only does that help all kinds of social interactions, because once you believe that certain objects do things, you can say, well, that one didn't reciprocate last time, so forget it. I'm not going to reciprocate this time. Or conversely, that's my buddy, he's always reciprocate. So you need a sense of agency for that, and for saying things like, I have a model of myself that involves free will, meaning I am an agent that does things. I'm not just a piece of this massive kind of a pool of causes and effects that can't be divided up in any way, kind of the way that presumably, LaPlace's demon sees things, right? If there was one that just a bunch of causes, a bunch of effects, and you don't partition it in any way. Living things have to partition it into what to them are salient causal nodes. So I think that's such a central concept.
So I wanted to ask a question then. Well, I want to ask two questions, perhaps a little bit more specific. So first is sort of a philosophical question. And so one of the things emphasized by the deep continuity hypothesis is a rejection of strict reductionism. Mm-hmm. And I noticed in your paper, you invoke in multiple places top-down causation. you criticize people, you criticize biology for taking just a bottom-up approach, which means you're committed to some kind of significant emergence. There are holes that have a causal power. As you say, it's easy to teach an animal to learn, but if I tried to manipulate all the individual neurons, that would take me forever, right? So there's that hole has a causal power that is not explainable just by the aggregation of the component parts. Is that a fair attribution to you?
Yeah, that's quite fair. Yeah.
Right. So the interesting thing, the interesting sort of conceptual problem, this is why it's a philosophical problem, is to try and get clear about what the relevant balance is. What I mean by that, right? There's identity going all the way down, right? Or else we wouldn't even be having this conversation. But it's not the logical identity or even the causal identity of strict reductionism. So there's also differentiation all the way up, if I can put it that way, in important ways. The differentiation in the sense of new emerging causal powers. And so I've been trying to figure out what kind of ontology actually properly talks about and gives an intelligible integration of these two. And I wondered if you've had any thoughts around that. That's the first question. I know there's a very big philosophical question, but I can tell from your writing, you're very philosophically astute. So I think it's a fair question to ask.
Yeah, so I'll test out. I've been thinking about this hard, and these are all provisional ideas, but I'll test them out and see what you think. I mean, these are tough issues, but let's see what you think. So one thing we can think about, and this comes out of some conversations that Eric Hull and I have been having, is if you think about, let's imagine for a second that Laplace's demon could exist, right? There's all kinds of reasons why it can't, but let's assume for the moment that basically there's no deterministic chaos or anything like that, and it really can track every molecule and every particle and all that. Now, the thing with that is that while it's true that kind of process, tracking the microstates, would be able to predict everything that was going to happen from a certain scenario going forward. What it strikes me is that kind of way of dealing with the world is an observer only. It cannot act. And the reason it can't act is because once you've committed to only tracking the microstates and you don't believe in mesoscale or higher scale anything, all the states are the same to you. So, for example, if you were asked to play chess, all the different states in which the king is just slightly moved over and the pawn is a little bit tilted makes no difference to the chess. But to you, all of these are equally different. They are all different. And so all of these states are completely different. And so you couldn't possibly choose a next step. You could predict what would happen once someone set up a scenario and asked you what will happen next. You could do that, but you would never act. You couldn't act because all of the preferences in terms of acting so that something rather than something else would happen, they're all choices between macrostates. They all require you to be able to distinguish that this group of microstates is a win in chess. This group of microstates are all the states where I don't starve, and this is something else. If you don't believe in those groupings, you can't act. All you can do is be an observer, a passive observer to the states that somebody else sets up. So I think the problem with this kind of reductionism, unlike among other problems, is that it's a worldview that is incompatible with what we really want from a worldview, which is to help you do new things. You want, a scientific worldview is supposed to help you make new discoveries. It's supposed to help you do new engineering. This is an incredibly sterile view. It talks only about prediction of what someone else had already established, a starting state, and it gives you no way of doing it, of actually doing anything. It's not a participatory view. It's sort of you're an observer only. So I think that, given what we want from these kind of worldviews, this thing fails on the most important account. The other thing I can sort of say about that is that literally now with the new developments in causal emergence, there is now math to literally analyze a given situation and to determine whether or not the most work is done at the lowest level. And in many cases, it is true. In many cases, that's true. But in other cases, it isn't. And so we no longer, it's amazing to me that we are now living in a kind of a world where we no longer have to have philosophical beliefs about it. You can calculate. There's literally a toolkit. There's a piece of software, and you can calculate how much of the causal work is done at the different levels for a given system. Now you can only sort of formally solve it for quite small systems, right? You can't, the math blows up like crazy. But the implications are quite clear that there literally are scenarios in which most of the work is done at not the lowest level. So in important ways, that question has been moved from philosophical endless debates to actually a rigorous kind of empirical question that you can now do the calculation.
Well, I'd like to see, I don't doubt you, by the way, but I'd like to see the map.
Sure.
That'd be really wonderful, because I've been making similar arguments. I've been making epistemological arguments around the fact that any worldview has to give a proper, real ontological causal status to science and scientists and people making measurements.
Yes.
And that requires that they have an ontological existence that is in some sense real. You don't want to get a ontology that only the bottom level is real, because then the scientists and their measurements and their theories and their calculations become unreal, and then the basis for making the assertions about the bottom ontology undermine themselves completely. And Karen, I think Smith is making a very similar argument in the vertical ascent with the measurement problem.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of stuff converging around this. Okay, so thank you, Mike. That was a very helpful answer, and I'm very excited to see the map. So for me, I've looked at sort of ontologies, and I've tried to, and what I've been looking for ontologies that, what is odd sentence? Anyways, ones that have both bottom-up emergence and top-down emanation, top-down causation, bottom-up. And historically, the best example I've been able to find is neoplatonism, because it has consistently talked about this, and it also talks very similar about sort of the emanation down and emergence up of mind-like properties and intelligibility properties. All, these take pride of place within those ontologies. And so I'm wondering if you think, because I've been making the argument that I think we are on the cusp of a kind of revival of this Neoplatonic ontology. And for me, that's important in a way that might go beyond sort of your particular purview, but because if we could integrate that Neoplatonic worldview with very powerful biological and cognitive science worldview, like we're talking about now, that Neoplatonic worldview also has a legacy of being kind of the cultural cognitive grammar of a lot of the spirituality of the West. To my mind, that could help integrate science and spirituality in an intellectually and philosophically rigorous and respectable manner, in a way that could help address what I call the meaning crisis. The fact that the standard picture of the world does not have any proper ontological place for us within it. I just wondered if you had any sort of similar thoughts along those lines, or even how that just strikes you as a proposal. Yeah,
really interesting. And the vast majority of it, I haven't even begun to, in terms of the meaning. I mean, you're the expert in that aspect. But the funny thing is, I have been thinking hard about this kind of a Platonic worldview, which again, this is not something I would ever bring up in a talk to molecular biologists or anything like this, right?
Yeah, of course.
This is kind of the only forum in which it makes sense to bring that up. But I'll tell you, I mean, here we're confronting it in the laboratory all the time, and I don't know of a better way to start to think about this. I mean, here's the simple example, and then I'll give you a real example. The simple example is, let's say that you were evolving some sort of creature that needed to be a triangle. And so you evolve the first angle, and then you evolve the second angle. Well, you don't need to evolve the third angle. You already know what the third angle has to be.
Right.
You don't need to evolve it. Now that's a curious thing. Where does that fact live? Now, this is something that, of course, mathematicians have been talking about forever, and this idea that there's some sort of Platonic world where these truths of mathematics hang out. there are so many things like this. When evolution discovers ion channels, which are these proteins, right, that are many of them are, they control the voltage, but they are themselves voltage sensitive. These things are basically transistors. They are voltage gated current conductances. As soon as you've discovered the transistor, you can now make logic gates. It's very simple. With a couple of transistors, you can make logic gates. Logic gates come with a truth table, this wonderful piece of logic, where in the evolution didn't have to specify the truth table. All evolution did was find the ion channel. After that, you suddenly get this miraculous gift from the laws of logic, wherever they live. And it's what physicists will often call a free lunch. It's this thing that you don't need to, you sort of get that for free from the laws of physics. So we have free lunches from geometry, from algebra, from computation, from all of these different areas where evolution doesn't need to discover all of that stuff. What it does need to make is it needs to make a proper machine that is able to harness these aspects that then live. I don't know where they live, right? So this is where I start thinking about this Platonic idea, because we see this all the time. Evolution finds the right piece of hardware, and immediately all these things become available to you that were not available before you made the machine. So you need some kind of almost like an index into this world of possibilities. But once you have that index, you have access to all the stuff that you did not have to evolve from scratch. And a simple kind of real example that we confront is we've taken skin cells from a frog embryo, and we show that left to their own devices, when you sort of liberate them from the rest of the other cells that normally bully them into being kind of a boring two-dimensional skin layer, they make this thing called a xenobot. It's basically a kind of a self-motile new proto-organism. It swims around, it does mazes, it interacts with each other. They make copies of themselves the way von Neumann wanted, by going around and finding loose skin cells and packing them together into a little ball that then becomes the next generation of xenobots. Okay. All of that with a standard frog genome. We don't edit the genome for those. That's just what they already do. But unlike every other creature you've ever seen, when you ask, okay, why is it a certain color? Why does it have this many legs? Why is it? The answer is usually, well, there's a long history of selection and everybody else died off. And so you've selected for the, okay, there's never been any xenobots. There's never been any selection to be a good xenobot. Where within 48 hours, those cells figure out how to be a completely different organism, have different capacities, and do all this stuff. Where does that come from? Well, how is it, right? Without a long history of specific selection to be a great xenobot, why is it that the Xenopus laevis genome knows how to do this as well? And so you're left with this idea that what evolution's actually doing is it's not finding specific solutions to specific environments. What it's doing is making problem-solving machines that can index into certain aspects of this incredible pool of free gifts from mathematics, from logic, from who knows what else is out there, and that's, to me, that's a very kind of Neoplatonic view that these things exist, and it's on us to sort of index into them and make use of them.
That is so cool. That is so cool. That is really cool. So I want to shift to another question then now, which is now at the opposite end. Well, maybe not. The first was very philosophical, and I really appreciated your answer. This is very exciting for me. But I was wondering at the other end, so this is more of the psychologist speaking. I mean, you clearly have provided good evidence for fractal levels of cognition and information exchange, and there's communication flowing up and down between these levels. So I wondered if you'd ever turned that towards a specific issue, which has always been sort of problematically present in psychology, but especially in clinical psychology and in medicine, which is like the placebo effect. Because the placebo effect, right, especially for like pure reductionists, is a very hard thing to explain. Right? Very, very hard thing to explain. But one of the things that occurred to me as I was reading it is, it looks like you've actually provided, right, a framework that could give, a plausible explanation for how it could occur. I mean, I can't do it with your expertise, but I was thinking, well, surely there can be, right, there's information processing here, and it could be passed down this fractal chain in important ways, and that would help to explain something like the placebo effect. And that may strike you as rather sideways of your main goals, but like if we could get an explanation of that rather than just pointing to it, right? Our abilities to, to run psychological experiments, to run clinical trials, to propose medicines would be significantly improved. And so I just wondered if that had occurred to you.
Oh, yeah. This is so critical and important. We actually, a couple of years ago, we published an example of a computer model of the placebo effect in gene regulatory networks. Never mind brains, never mind, or just a bare. And the way it works is like this. Imagine the typical model of a gene regulatory network is just a bunch of nodes, let's say 10 or 50 or however many, and there's some arrows. This one turns that gene on, that gene turns this gene off, this one turns that on. And so it's this like hairy ball of interactions where each gene turns on and off the other. And so normally what you would do is you would use some sort of dynamical systems theory to say, okay, it has some attractors. This is what it could, these are the states that it could do. And these gene regulatory networks are really critical for building the body in the first place, health and disease, all kinds of pathways back. So typically you would look at this thing and you would say, well, I can see all the interactions. There's no magic here. The agency sort of on the scale of where, of agency of this thing, it's got to be all the way on the left. This thing's just a piece of physics. There's no mind there. So what we did was we said, well, you can't just decide that from an armchair. Let's find out. Let's find out how much of the tools of behavior science actually ports to this thing, because I was interested in decision making during cellular decision making during development and things like this. And so what we tried were some just really simplistic behaviorist techniques that you would use to train something. I said that my postdoc and I did this. I said pretend I said Pavlov's dog. Right? Pretend this thing is a dog. Let's just try training it. And what I mean is that to any one pick any one gene and use that as your conditioned stimulus. The other one is your unconditioned stimulus, and pick a third one that's your response. And let's just see what happens. And so what we found is that biological networks, and we looked at like 40 or 50 of these biological networks, they have 6 different kinds of learning that they can do, including associative learning, like Pavlovian conditioning, if you pick the nodes correctly. And so what that means is exactly what you just said. It's an example of that kind of placebo effect, because you can do this. Imagine this: you have one drug that very strongly causes some effect in this network. Okay, that drug targets one node, that's your unconditioned stimulus, and when you apply it, boom, this other thing turns on. Okay, it percolates to the network, this other thing turns on. You've got another drug, that's your neutral stimulus, and it hits a different node, and when you hit that node, nothing happens. It's neutral, it's completely neutral. Well, it turns out that with many of these networks, and by the way, not so much with random networks, which means evolution actually likes this is a biological thing. If you present those two stimuli together some number of times, what will happen in the future is that just giving the neutral drug alone is now sufficient to hit this thing, just like Pavlov's dog. To me, that's an example of the placebo effect, because what you're saying to the pharmacologist is, I can train this tissue so that you are going to give it a completely inert sugar pill, and it's going to act as if you just gave it one of your most potent drugs. And the reason you might want to do that is because some of those potent drugs are actually too strong to be used in humans.
Yes,
too much,
exactly.
right? So you could I think you're right on the money. If the gene regulatory networks can have placebo effect, I mean, it only stands to reason it will scale up with, right? And I'm sure you're probably more familiar than I with this, but have you seen like Albert Mason's stuff on dermatology? Okay, you should. I'll remind me afterwards. I'll send you like this. This is amazing. So this guy, and unfortunately he passed away. I tried to send him an email and I found out he already passed. He was a hypnotist that basically he was delivering babies, and he didn't like using anesthetics because he felt that it would impact and so he decided to use hypnosis. So he was in the UK. He started doing deliveries of babies under hypnosis, no anesthesia. His fellow doctors sort of made fun of him and said, well, if hypnosis is so great here, and they gave him a kid with some sort of horrible skin disease on both arms. So, his skin was basically black. He was missing some kind of one of the important skin cells he was missing. So he found out, and then for decades he ran this practice of hypnodermatology, whereby giving suggestions he could clear up certain kinds of skin disorders. Now, this is very important, as you said, going across levels, right? Because you're communicating on a very high level with language, you're saying, your left arm, and in fact, he did that. He started by clearing one arm, not the other. So which is just amazing. And so right, but that somehow filters down into the molecular signals that it needs that the skin cells need to do whatever. So it's crossing multiple levels. And then the amazing thing at the end of his, so this is a set of lectures that he gave, like an interview. At the end, he said he left his practice and he became a psychiatrist and doing counseling, because what he realized was that dealing with problems at that level, what would happen is the specific symptoms would clear up as they should, but it would pop up somewhere else. So he was noticing that his patients, right? So yeah, their skin cleared up, but now they started smoking, or they had to get a divorce because they were too whatever. So so he tried to climb to an even higher level and say, let's see if we can resolve this on some sort of psychological level. But I think what you identified is one of the most important things for medicine for the next century. Is understanding that cross-level connections and saying, what is it that what is the interface to these cells, and apparently your brain and your ability to comprehend eventually filters down to control that to some mechanisms that can control the cells. And just as a last thing, we shouldn't be terribly surprised about this. I realized just recently, if you say to someone, I can voluntarily change the resting potential of 30% of my body cells. Let's say you're crazy. You can't voluntarily control your resting potential. Well, how do you get up out of bed in the morning? That's exactly what you're doing. You're voluntarily changing the bioelectrical properties of your muscle cells. That's what you're doing. You actually do have bioelectric control over some of your body cells, and maybe many of your body cells that you don't necessarily use or know about. And so so using therapy, hypnosis, whatever it's going to be, as an interface to that low level cellular system is going to be, it's got to be the future of medicine. I'm sure of it. Trying to micromanage it with drugs is temporary, I think.
Can I jump in here for a second, because you just hit one of my triggers. I've been working for many years with a guy who, I guess the world would probably call him a massage therapist, but that's not what he actually does. He's actually developed a thing that he calls reposturing. And what he does is he works on the skeletal and the musculature and the fascia and all the things that connect everything together, so that you could have a significant back injury of some sort, or significant incapacity in one part of your body. And what he does is he gets every single thing stretched out. And then when he gets it all stretched out, the body just takes care of itself and lines itself back up again. The spine will reorganize into, it's very hard to describe what it is that he does, but I know it works because he's done it on me. But he's gone beyond that in what happens quite frequently. And this sounds really woo-woo. I know it sounds woo-woo, but I've experienced it. That when some parts of the human body get tense and react out of maybe some sort of trauma that you've had in the past, or some emotional difficulties, psychological difficulties that you may not even be aware of. And so certain parts of your body will really tighten up, especially this area around the saddle. The legs will draw in and make that whole area very tight, so that the hips become immobile and it's hard to walk. And when he worked on that and got that, and it's quite a long, painful process, but once he gets the whole thing stretched out, I experienced what I can only call as like an electrical signal that went from the tips of my toes all the way up through the top of my head and all the way out through my hands, a buzzing that just went through my entire body and caused my whole body to relax. And it changed my psyche at the same time that it changed my physical body. Now that sounds to me like what you're talking about when you talk about something that goes down through all the levels, that's meeting the need at some lower level. Could that be a bioelectric signal that somehow comes from the top down? Or maybe even, I mean, who knows? I think he was working with chakras, but he doesn't use the chakra language. And I don't know anything about the whole chakra thing. John might know more about that than I do. Does that sound like anything you've ever heard of before, John?
I mean, I've read documented cases of things like that and Kundalini experiences and chi.
See, I don't know anything about any of those things, so I don't come at it with some sort of presupposition that that's going to happen. I just know I experienced it, and I know other people that have experienced it when he's working on them. So, you know, there's something about the bioelectrical signaling has something to do with this whole top-down and bottom-up thing.
So I think what Mike and I are talking about makes it a hypothesis to be considered. The problem with this, the placebo, is we have to be sort of very ruthlessly empirical about this, precisely because of the power of the placebo effect, right? And so I'm epistemologically Karen, I'm not saying, like what you're saying is, could it be, is it now in the realm of scientific possibility as opposed to woo-woo? Yes, I would be willing to I would be willing to countenance that as, right? We're discovering stuff about that, that this kind of hyper multi-level coordination that's going on in things like the 1-inch punch. Now it's not magic, but people can do, I think I can do it, right? And you can measure it. They can get up to like 70% of a full punch in a way that is using the coordination system of the small musculature very differently than how it's standardly used. And these are measurable things. My concern when I hear these things, though, is I don't know, right? I really don't know, precisely because, right, I think people have a tremendous power to placebo themselves into certain things. And so what your statement does for me is arouse a genuine curiosity. I would want to do like, well, can we reliably reproduce this? Once we can reliably reproduce it, if we control for other things, does it still exist? So reliable reproduction, then we look for construct validity. And after construct validity, can we integrate it into already existing construct? Then I would feel that I would be in a position to answer the question. That's what I typically try to do with woo phenomena. I try to bring them progressively through that kind of regime.
Well, could there be some sort of a connection to the noise to signal ratio or the way that stochastic resonance will amp a signal when you get this? Because I know that they've even used the stochastic resonance thing to create vibrations in the floor so that when people put their feet on it, that signal will go up through the body and actually have some sort of a healing effect on the body. But stochastic resonance is used all the time in audio work to amp a signal and make it more understandable.
I guess what I would say back to, and then I'll be quiet so Mike can speak, is yes, maybe. And I've also heard many other alternative explanations of possible mechanisms. And so again, there's a real danger of all kinds of confounded conflation. And that does not deny the phenomenon under investigation. It makes me say I want to be very, very careful in how I go about establishing claims about the causal mechanisms that underlie the phenomena, precisely because of the power of the placebo effect. Right? And we've known about this even in certain ways for a long time. The clever Hans phenomena, right, and other things, and right, you can get people to do because of the power of implicit learning and placebo. People can sort of shape themselves relatively unconsciously to particular metaphysics and ontology quite readily. That's one of their great gifts, but it's also one of their great flaws. And so I would say,
well, that's the great thing about doing it with rigorous science, is that you can't have any impact on the meaning crisis if you're just talking. It has to be, right? It has to speak to the people who are in the scientific worldview.
So that's exactly why I asked Mike the question I asked before, which is, I see what he's doing, and I think also converging with what I'm doing as moving towards, a different kind of ontology, an ontology that can get science and spirituality talking together in a very rigorous, but nevertheless, meaningful fashion. But I've been talking too much. I want to give Mike a chance to reply.
Well, I mean, so I 100% agree with kind of the methodology that you laid out for how one would study these things. That's exactly what I would think. I don't know anything specifically about the examples that you've mentioned. The only things I will say is that well, a couple of things. One is that we know that biomechanical signals, including bioelectrical signals, and at the cellular level, they're a kind of cognitive glue. Those are the things that bind cells together into larger constructs. So when individual cells can handle sort of cell level goals, metabolics and other things, but a collection of cells can do tissue level things like have shape and morphogenesis and so on. And so that what enables them to do that are biomechanical properties that are field-like and bioelectrical computations and so on. And so I wouldn't be shocked at all if that same kind of strategy propagated all the way up, so that a particular biomechanical adjustment of a complex system would then percolate into not just the physical structure of it, but the information content. I mean, that's what the bioelectric system really is for. It's not just another piece of physics. It actually mediates the information content of the organ, the body, and of course in the brain. That's obvious that happens. So I wouldn't be surprised by this at all. And the other thing I'll say is that I think John, you're absolutely right. We need to understand the contribution of the placebo component of that, the actual, like, okay, what was actually done on a mechanistic level. But what's interesting to me about that is that I think we need to move to a place where, so I think for example, currently most studies of pharmacology, what they would like to do is to get rid of the placebo effect, to null it out in some fashion, right? And what they want to remain with is the purely molecular, I have designed a drug, it binds the protein, and I know exactly what it's going to do, right? I think down the line, what we're going to have is, there's some of that, but there's also a really important context for that molecular network. What has it learned in the last X number of years? And what are the stimuli that we are giving it? What are we actually stimulating it to do? Given, basically to me, that question of control at a higher level is not any less real or less valuable. In fact, it's probably much more powerful than trying to micromanage it from the bottom up with drugs and so on. So I think down the line, that understanding of it, which now we sort of just see it as placebo, I think it's a whole constellation of interesting sort of proto-cognitive features of our body organs and tissues and so on. That's going to be the main act, and the molecular and kind of the molecular stuff eventually is going to be the minor part of it, and the rest of it is going to be the major part. I have to apologize. In about 4 minutes, I mean, this hour has gone by incredibly fast. I can't believe it's been an hour, and I'm gonna have to go at 5 because I have another meeting I can't get out of. But we should, if you're willing, we should do this again and keep going, because
I'm
so
most
much
willing.
interesting stuff.
I found this fascinating and thrilling, Mike. I'm so
likewise,
so
super interesting.
Yeah, so grateful, Karen, that you put us together.
Exactly.
So far, I've only asked one question. So we could do this many more times, but I'm just glad it worked out. And thank you for letting me know that you've got this thing coming up, Mike. So we have 4 minutes left. Anything you want to say to wrap up before Mike goes, or?
Me?
Any question you have for him, John, that he could answer?
Well, I've got more, but I think they would not be answerable in 4 minutes. Instead, just remind Mike, he was going to send me a couple of things, and if he could do
Albert
that.
Mason on hypnodermatology, psychodermatology.
And the other one on the math of emergence.
Yes, Eric Hole's work. Yeah, I'll point you there. Yeah, and you might, I'll introduce you. You can talk to him. I hired him in our center a few years ago because I thought his work was just incredibly profound in its implications.
That is so cool.
Very deep implications. So yeah, please let's do this again. We barely scratched the surface of. I have so many things I want to hear your take on. So we'll do this again.
Well,
and if it's okay that I could get those 2 things, I would also like to put them in the show notes for other people who are following along.
Sure.
Well, count me in. Let's set up the next meeting. And Mike, I really enjoy your manner right? You come in, you're very good faith, and there is, there's warmth and enthusiasm.
Likewise.
It's a pleasure to be in your presence. So
Likewise. Yeah, I feel there's a real opportunity to learn and to make our craft better and to get somewhere together. So yeah, I think that'd be great.
excellent.
Sounds good. Let's schedule something for the future.
Perfect.
Great talking to both of you. Thank you so much.
Likewise. All right.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you
Thanks
very
so
much. Bye, Mike. We'll be talking
Bye-bye.
again.
Absolutely. Thanks. Bye.